Ordered to pick a bride, I chose the fiercest alien in the room. Jackson stood at the entrance of the grand hall, eyes scanning the room filled with alien dignitaries, warriors, and politicians. The ceremony had begun, and he had been chosen to make a decision that would change his life forever. He wasn't prepared for this. In his years of fighting across the galaxy, he had never been asked to make such a personal choice. The whole event felt like a spectacle, a political game where alliances were forged not by merit but by bloodlines and influence. As he stepped forward, a loud voice echoed across the room, announcing the reason for this gathering. Today, he would choose his bride. It wasn't an ordinary wedding. In this part of the galaxy, the bonds between species weren't forged through love or respect, but through political strategy and strength. Each woman presented to him came from a powerful race or faction, each one a weapon in her own right. The idea was simple. Pick the woman who would strengthen his status, someone who could be a worthy partner in a galaxy filled with danger and warfare. Jackson's eyes shifted from one alien to the next. There were tall, elegant figures with skin that shimmered like liquid silver, their long limbs flowing gracefully as they stood tall, awaiting his choice. Others had the muscular build of warriors, their skin hardened and covered in intricate tattoos marking their fierce histories. Each one seemed perfect for a life of power and influence, but Jackson wasn't interested in power. He was interested in survival. As the candidates stepped forward, their eyes locked with his, each waiting for him to make the decision. There was beauty in them all, but none of them sparked anything in him. Jackson's thoughts were not on politics, nor on the glittering promises of wealth or status. He needed someone who could understand the life he led, someone who could fight at his side, not sit beside him on a throne. Then she entered the room. She wasn't like the others. Lyra stood in the corner, her presence commanding the space around her. The other women seemed to fade into the background as her fierce green eyes caught Jackson's gaze. Her skin was a deep shade of blue, decorated with scars that told the story of a warrior's life. She was dressed in battle armor, not the regal gowns the others wore. Her hair, dark as midnight, was tied back in a simple braid, and her posture spoke of discipline, strength, and an undeniable will. Jackson didn't need to look at the others anymore. This was the one. There was something about Lyra that drew him in. Her reputation had reached his ears long before this event. She was a warrior, a leader of her people, known for her ferocity and unmatched strength in combat. Rumor had it that she had defeated entire armies single-handedly, her blade never faltering, her heart never afraid. And yet she stood there now among the others, offering herself not as a conqueror but as a potential bride. It seemed like an insult, a challenge, and that was exactly what he needed. As the ceremony continued, Jackson made his decision. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and, to the shock of the room, pointed directly at Lyra. The whispers began immediately. The other women, dignitaries from powerful planets and factions, eyed him with disdain. How could he choose her, a woman covered in battle scars, wearing the face of a warrior and not a queen? Jackson didn't care. His mind was made up. Lyra's eyes remained calm as she stepped forward. She didn't speak, but the look in her eyes was one of challenge. She wasn't here to please anyone, and she certainly wasn't here for a marriage of convenience. She didn't want to be part of a political game, especially not with a human. But there was something about this choice, about the man who dared to look past the facade of power, that intrigued her. "Are you sure?" one of the dignitaries asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Jackson's gaze never wavered. "I am sure." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly, not out of anger but curiosity. There was something different about him, something raw and unrefined, something that stood apart from the polished men and women around him. She had always been told that the human race was weak, soft, and primitive. But Jackson was not like the others she had met. His face held no mask, no pretensions, only the quiet resolve of a soldier who had seen too much and was done with playing the game. As she stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his, she wondered what it was about this human that made him stand out. But her thoughts were interrupted as the ceremony continued. The journey to the next planet was silent. Jackson and Lyra shared the same transport ship, but their eyes rarely met. It was a tension that neither of them had ever experienced. Jackson, who had faced death countless times on the battlefield, had never been so unsure about what to expect from a companion. Lyra, on the other hand, had no interest in forming a connection, especially not with a human she didn't trust. In the past, Her people, the Zynar, had been warriors, fighting for survival and dominance. Love, marriage, and alliances were not the concerns of her kind. They valued strength, loyalty, and the ability to stand alone. Lyra had grown up in that environment, surrounded by the harshness of war, and she had never once been given a choice in whom she would marry. Her fate had always seemed sealed by the strength she carried. But now here she was, on a ship with a man who had chosen her not for her strength but for something else. She didn't know whether to feel insulted or intrigued. Jackson, meanwhile, found himself watching her more than he intended. She was a mystery, one that made him want to understand her, despite the walls she kept up. The other women, the ones from wealthy or political backgrounds, had been easy to read. They wore masks of politeness, speaking in sweet tones, always calculating their next move. But Lyra, she didn't care for any of that. She stood firm in who she was, and that intrigued him. It made her more than just a prize to win. She was a challenge, a puzzle, and he was curious to know what lay beneath the surface. The quiet between them stretched for days as they traveled through the stars, only broken by the occasional exchange of words that carried the weight of duty rather than anything personal. Lyra spent most of her time training, honing her combat skills, her eyes always sharp and focused. Jackson would sometimes watch from the corner of his eye, impressed by the sheer precision of her movements. She was unlike any fighter he had seen. Her body flowed like water in combat, swift and graceful, yet deadly. It wasn't until they landed on the next planet that the first crack in their tension began to show. The planet Zalmer was a barren wasteland, filled with remnants of past wars and abandoned cities. It was a place where only the strongest survived, and it was here that their journey took an unexpected turn. As soon as they stepped off the transport, the heat of the planet hit them like a wave. Jackson could feel the dry air cut through his skin. The landscape stretched out before them, an endless sea of sand and jagged rocks. Lyra looked around, her sharp eyes scanning the area, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her blade. "Why are we here?" Jackson asked, wiping the sweat from his brow. "This is where I prove my worth," Lyra replied, her voice steady. "Before I can return to my people, I must complete the trials. It is the way of my kind. You will stay out of my way." Jackson frowned but said nothing. He had been expecting to travel to a more civilized place, to attend more political events, but this was different. Lyra didn't need to prove anything to him. She had already won his respect by choosing to be who she was. But as he followed her into the vast expanse of the barren world, he couldn't help but feel a spark of something he couldn't explain. She was fierce, yes, but she was also alone, isolated by the choices her people had forced upon her. Over the next few days, they made their way deeper into the desert. Lyra was focused, always ahead, her movements as precise as ever. Jackson, though exhausted from the harsh environment, couldn't help but admire her determination. But he began to notice something else, something that kept him at a distance from her, despite their proximity. Lyra was running from something. It was only on the fourth day that he saw it clearly. Lyra had been silent, her face stoic, but at night, when the stars blanketed the sky, she would allow herself a moment of vulnerability. It was during one of these moments, as they sat by their campfire, that he saw it, the faint trace of pain in her eyes. "Why did you choose this life?" Jackson asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Lyra looked at him, her eyes narrowing as if she had just realized he had been watching her. "I didn't choose this life," she said, her voice soft, almost regretful. "It chose me." She paused for a long time, staring into the fire. Jackson said nothing, sensing that the walls she had built around herself were slowly beginning to crack. She finally spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "I was trained to fight, to kill, to survive. But in the end, I'm nothing more than a weapon to my people. They don't care about what I want or need. I'm not allowed to choose." Jackson felt the weight of her words. He had spent his life fighting for survival too, but he had never known a life where choices were taken from him. "But you do have a choice now," he said gently, his eyes meeting hers. Lyra's gaze shifted away from the fire, her jaw tightening as if the words were too heavy to bear. "I don't know if I can trust that. I've been forced into too many situations where I had no say. And now you want me to trust you, to trust that this arrangement, this bond, will be different. But I can't, not yet." Jackson didn't respond. He understood her fear, her hesitation. Trust wasn't something that could be given freely, especially not in a world as cruel as theirs. But he also knew that in order for them to survive the path ahead, they would have to trust each other. They spent the next few days traveling through the desert, Jackson giving Lyra space when she needed it. But there were moments, brief flashes, when he could see the fierce woman she was, how her pride and strength could be an asset, not just to him, but to the galaxy. He knew that they had a long road ahead of them, but there was something in the way Lyra held herself that made him believe they could face anything together. Then came the trial. On the 7th day, they reached an ancient ruin deep within the desert. The massive stone walls towered over them, a reminder of a civilization long forgotten. It was here that Lyra would face her trial, a battle against a creature said to be the most dangerous in the galaxy. Jackson stood at the entrance of the ruins, watching as Lyra prepared herself for the fight of her life. She stood tall, her hand firmly gripping her weapon, her gaze focused on the unknown. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty swirling in his chest. Lyra turned to him, a small, almost imperceptible smile curling at the corners of her lips. "I was born ready." As she stepped forward, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was the woman he had chosen, the one who would not bow to anyone, not even the galaxy's most dangerous creatures. And in that moment, Jackson realized that he had made the right choice. Not just for the political power that came with her, but for the strength and determination she held within her. He would stand by her side. And together they would face whatever the galaxy had in store for them. The ancient ruins loomed ahead, their stone walls weathered by centuries of storms and forgotten battles. Lyra stood at the entrance, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond. She could feel the weight of the trial pressing down on her, the challenge she had to face alone. Jackson stood at her side, his presence a quiet reassurance, but she knew this was something she had to do on her own. For a moment she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, grounding herself. The fight ahead wasn't just a physical battle. It was a test of everything she had been through, everything she had become. She had always been a warrior, trained to fight and survive, but this trial was different. It was a rite of passage for her people, a test of her strength and resolve. If she failed, it would mean more than just death. It would mean she wasn't worthy of her place among the Xynar. "Are you sure you're ready?" Jackson's voice was low, his concern clear in his eyes. He knew how much this meant to her, how much she had fought to get here. "I have no choice," Lyra said, her voice steady. "This is who I am." Jackson nodded, his gaze never leaving her face. He knew she was strong, but there was something in the way she said it, something that made him wonder if she was really ready. Lyra had never been one to back down, but Jackson could see the hesitation in her eyes. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it wasn't just about the fight. It was about something deeper, something more personal. "I'll be here when you're done," Jackson said, his words a quiet promise. Lyra turned towards the entrance of the ruins, her hand tightening on the hilt of her sword. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the stone halls as she ventured into the darkness, the air growing colder with every step. The silence was oppressive, the kind of silence that only comes before something dangerous. She could feel the presence of something watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. The further she walked, the more the feeling of unease grew. She wasn't sure if it was the atmosphere of the ruins or if it was the weight of the trial itself. Either way, the tension in the air was thick. Her hand never left her weapon, her senses alert, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. Suddenly, the ground shook beneath her feet, and a low growl echoed from the darkness ahead. Lyra's instincts kicked in. She had trained for moments like this. Without thinking, she rushed forward, her blade drawn, ready for whatever lay ahead. Out of the shadows, a massive creature emerged, its eyes glowing with a fierce, otherworldly light. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. A mix of animal and machine, its body covered in spiked armor and its mouth filled with jagged metal teeth. The creature was at least 10 feet tall, its massive form blocking the narrow passageway. For a moment, Lyra hesitated, studying the creature's movements. It was fast, and its sheer size made it a formidable opponent. But Lyra didn't back down. She was ready for this. She lunged forward, her sword cutting through the air with precision, aiming for the creature's exposed underbelly. But the creature was quicker than she expected, its body twisting to the side just in time to avoid the blow. The two of them clashed in the narrow corridor, the sound of metal scraping against metal ringing out. Lyra was relentless, her movements fluid and precise, but the creature was fierce, striking with brutal force whenever it had the chance. Lyra's body was already beginning to ache from the battle, but she pushed through, knowing that she couldn't afford to lose. Her mind raced as she fought, calculating every move, every strike. She was beginning to understand the creature's pattern, its rhythm. It wasn't just about brute strength, it was about endurance strategy. She knew she had to outsmart it, not just overpower it. With a swift movement, she feigned a strike to the creature's left side, watching as it reacted. The creature's massive claw swiped through the air, missing her by inches. Lyra saw her opening. She took a step back, using the momentum of her opponent's missed attack to deliver a powerful thrust into its side. The creature howled in pain as her blade sank deep into its armor. But it wasn't enough. The creature roared, spinning around with terrifying speed, its claws reaching for her. Lyra barely had time to dodge, rolling out of the way just as the creature's claw scraped the stone floor where she had been standing moments before. She was tired. Her breath was labored, her limbs aching, but she couldn't stop now. She couldn't afford to fail. She had fought too hard to get here, too long to turn back now. With renewed determination, Lyra launched herself at the creature, using the last of her strength to land a blow that shattered its armor. The creature staggered, its form faltering as its movements grew slower and more erratic. Lyra didn't hesitate. With a final, powerful strike, she pierced its heart, bringing the beast down in a heap of broken metal and flesh. For a moment, all was still. The silence of the ruins seemed to swallow the sounds of battle, leaving only the echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. She stood over the creature's fallen body, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Her body ached, but she was alive. She had done it. She had passed the trial. As she wiped the blood from her blade, a sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't the victory she had expected, but it was enough. She had proven to herself that she was more than just a weapon. She was a survivor, and no matter what the galaxy threw at her, she would face it head-on. She turned to leave the ruins, her mind still racing with adrenaline. As she stepped back into the light, she saw Jackson waiting for her, his eyes scanning her face, looking for any sign of injury. "You did it," he said, his voice soft but full of admiration. Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't easy," she said, her voice hoarse from the fight. "I can see that," Jackson replied with a small smile. For a moment they just stood there, the tension between them easing slightly. Lyra had completed the trial, but there was more to her journey than this. She had proven herself to her people, but now she had to prove herself to Jackson, to them both. The future was uncertain, and the galaxy was still a dangerous place, but for the first time in a long time, Lyra allowed herself a brief moment of peace. She had chosen this path, and she would see it through, no matter what. As they turned to leave the ruins behind, the weight of the galaxy's expectations heavy on their shoulders, Lyra knew one thing for sure. She wasn't alone anymore. The days following Lyra's victory in the ruins were filled with a strange calm. It was a peace that neither of them had expected, but one they welcomed nonetheless. The tension that had been between them slowly began to fade as they traveled together across the desert planet. Lyra's body had healed from the wounds she had sustained during the battle, but her mind was still restless. She was a warrior at heart, and rest was always a challenge for her. Jackson had noticed the change in her. Her usual stoic demeanor had softened slightly, and there was a quiet determination in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She no longer looked at him with the same wariness that had characterized their earlier encounters. Instead, she seemed almost thoughtful, as though she was starting to see him in a different light. They had spent the last few days traveling through vast, empty canyons and across fields of cracked, dried earth. The heat was relentless, and the landscape was barren, but Lyra seemed unfazed. She moved with purpose, her stride steady and strong. Jackson, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up. The weight of their supplies was starting to wear on him, and the heat drained his energy faster than he liked to admit. It was on the 5th day after the trial that they reached the edge of the desert, and the horizon opened up to reveal something unexpected. In the distance, a small settlement appeared, a cluster of simple buildings surrounded by a high wall. It was a stark contrast to the barren wasteland they had been crossing for days. "What is this place?" Jackson asked, his voice hoarse from the dry air. "This is Thalon, a safe haven for those who have nowhere else to go," Lyra explained, her voice quiet. "It's not much, but it's home for those who need it," Jackson frowned. "You've been here before?" Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. "I have, but it's not a place I return to often. It's not where I belong." They made their way to the entrance of the settlement, and the guards at the gate eyed them with suspicion as they approached. Lyra didn't seem bothered by their watchful gazes. She walked with the same calm confidence she always carried, her hand resting on the hilt of her blade as though it were second nature. "Lyra," one of the guards called as they reached the gate. "We weren't expecting you." Lyra stopped, meeting the guard's gaze. "I wasn't expecting to come either," she replied, her tone flat. "I need supplies, nothing more." The guard hesitated before nodding, stepping aside to let them pass. As they entered the settlement, Jackson couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the people who lived here and the warriors he had encountered in the galaxy. The people of Thallon were simple, living their lives in a quiet, humble way. There were no grand politics here, no elite power struggles, just everyday people trying to survive. Lyra led Jackson to a small shop on the outskirts of the settlement. Inside, the shelves were stocked with basic supplies: food, water, weapons, and tools. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. As they gathered what they needed, Jackson couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This place was nothing like the galactic capitals he had visited, where the rich and powerful controlled everything. The people here seemed disconnected from the larger universe. It was as though they had chosen to live outside of the chaos, in their own corner of the galaxy. Lyra had always been a part of that chaos. She had been born into a world of war and conflict, a world where survival was a constant struggle. The peaceful simplicity of this place felt like a dream she didn't know how to be part of. She turned to Jackson, noticing the way he looked around. "You don't belong here," she said quietly, almost to herself. Jackson raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. He was still taking in the settlement, observing the way the people moved, the way they interacted with one another. There was a sense of community here, something he hadn't seen in a long time. The relationships between the people felt genuine, not built on manipulation or ambition. It was a stark contrast to the politics he had grown used to. "I know," Jackson said finally, his voice soft. "But maybe this is where we should be right now, for a little while." Lyra looked at him, her gaze steady. "It's not a place for people like us, you'll see." They finished gathering the supplies they needed and made their way back to the edge of the settlement. As they reached the gate, the guard who had let them in earlier called out to them. "Lyra," the guard said, "there's someone who wants to speak with you." Lyra turned, her face hardening. "Who?" The guard stepped aside, revealing a tall figure standing just beyond the gate. It was a man dressed in simple clothes, but his presence was imposing. His eyes locked with Lyra's, and for a moment the world seemed to freeze. Jackson could see the tension in Lyra's body as she stood still, her expression betraying nothing. The man spoke first, his voice low but commanding. "Lyra, I didn't expect to find you here." "Darnock," Lyra said, her voice cold. "What do you want?" Jackson watched the exchange, sensing that this was no ordinary conversation. The tension between them was palpable. He had never seen Lyra react like this before. "I need your help," Darnock said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. "My people, we are under attack. The Alliance is breaking down and we need your strength. The Zynar need you." Lyra's eyes narrowed and Jackson could feel the change in her. She stood taller, her posture shifting as if she was preparing for something more. "I don't belong with the Zynar anymore. I've chosen my path." "You can't walk away from your people, Lyra," Darnock said, taking a step closer. "You owe them." "I owe no one," Lyra shot back. "Not anymore." There was a long silence between them, and Jackson could see the internal struggle in Lyra's eyes. Darnock's presence seemed to unsettle her, a reminder of everything she had fought to escape. She had spent so many years as a soldier, a weapon for her people, and now she was finally free, or so she had thought. "We'll help you," Jackson said, stepping forward to stand beside Lyra. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it. "But only if it's what you want." Lyra glanced at him, surprised by his words. It was the first time he had spoken with such certainty, the first time he had chosen to stand with her. She had always been alone, but now, with Jackson by her side, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. "I don't know if I can go back to that life," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But I'm not going to let anyone tell me what I have to do anymore." Darnock watched them for a long moment before speaking again. "The galaxy is changing, Lyra. The fight isn't over. We need you." Lyra looked away, her gaze drifting back to the horizon. She had fought for so long, but was the fight worth it? She wasn't sure, but one thing was clear: she couldn't do this alone, not anymore. "We'll do it," she said finally, her voice steady, her decision made. "But on our terms." Darnock nodded, his eyes filled with something resembling respect. "Then we'll meet again soon. The war isn't over." As Darnock turned to leave, Jackson and Lyra stood there for a moment, side by side. The weight of the decision hung between them. Lyra had made a choice, but she knew it wouldn't be the last one. There were still battles ahead, battles that would test their strength, their resolve, and their bond. But for the first time in a long time, Lyra felt ready. With Jackson at her side, she wasn't alone. And together they would face whatever the galaxy had in store for them. The winds had shifted. They were no longer just travelers across an unknown galaxy. They were warriors, bound by their pasts and their choices, heading toward an uncertain future. Lyra and Jackson had left the quiet peace of Thallon behind, knowing that the next chapter of their journey would be filled with more danger, more decisions, and more battles. They had not yet spoken of the decision they made together. The war was waiting, its call drawing them closer with every passing day. The galaxy was changing, and it was no longer a place where silence would be accepted. The alliance was crumbling, and factions were beginning to rise, each one with its own agenda. Lyra's people, the Xynar, were caught in the midst of it all. And though she had vowed never to return to the life they had tried to force upon her, she knew that the pull of her people was too strong to ignore forever. Jackson could see the conflict in her eyes. It was something he had come to understand over the past few weeks. She was a woman torn between the life she had chosen and the responsibilities she had never asked for. The warrior in her wanted to fight, to stand by her people, but the woman who had been through so much wanted to forge her own path. They had been traveling for hours across the vast desert landscape, heading toward the next settlement, where they would meet with Darnock and the others. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't the same as before. There was something else now, something that neither of them had expected. The bond they had formed was stronger than either had realized, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. They fought side by side, and though their paths had been different, they were walking them together now. "Do you think we're making the right choice?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence as they walked. Jackson glanced at her, his expression unreadable for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we don't have to make all the decisions now. We take it one step at a time, and whatever happens, we deal with it together." Lyra nodded, though the uncertainty remained in her eyes. It was rare for her to show doubt, but Jackson understood. She had spent her life fighting alone, and now she was being asked to trust someone else. Trust was not something easily earned, especially not for someone who had been betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. As they reached the settlement, Jackson could feel the change in the air. The atmosphere was thick with tension, the kind that came with the calm before a storm. There were soldiers stationed around the perimeter, their faces hard, their eyes constantly scanning for threats. Lyra's arrival had already caused a ripple through the settlement, and Jackson could tell that the people were nervous. They knew what was coming. The war was on the horizon, and no one was prepared for what it would bring. Darnock was waiting for them by the main gate, his tall frame standing out against the backdrop of the dusty settlement. His eyes were dark, his expression tense as he watched Lyra approach. "You've come," Darnock said, his voice low. "I didn't think you would." "I didn't think I would either," Lyra replied, her voice hard. "But here I am." Jackson stood back, watching the exchange. He could sense the history between them, the unspoken tension. There was something between them that went beyond words, something that neither of them seemed willing to acknowledge. But whatever it was, Jackson knew it was important. It was the kind of thing that could change the course of their future. "We've gathered the troops," Darnock continued, his eyes moving toward the small group of soldiers gathered behind him. "We're ready to move." Lyra nodded, her gaze focused on Darnock. "What's the plan?" Darnock paused, his gaze flicking to Jackson. He seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if weighing whether to share the full details with him. But then, with a sharp breath, he spoke. "The alliance is fractured. We've got factions on all sides, each one wanting to claim control. We need to strike before they get too powerful. We've identified a key stronghold, the central command for one of the largest factions. If we take it, we can destabilize their forces and buy ourselves some time." Lyra's eyes narrowed, her hand instinctively resting on the hilt of her sword. "And what about the rest of the galaxy? What's the plan after we take the stronghold?" "We regroup, strengthen our position, and then we make our next move," Darnock said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of uncertainty. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for control. Jackson could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just about fighting anymore. The stakes had risen. It was about power, control, and the future of the galaxy. The choices they made now would have consequences far beyond anything they had ever imagined. Lyra turned to Jackson, her expression hard. This is it, the fight we've been preparing for. Are you ready? Jackson met her gaze, his voice calm but filled with resolve. I've been ready for a long time. Together they stepped forward, moving toward the group of soldiers who were already preparing for the mission ahead. Lyra's focus was sharp, her every movement purposeful. She was a warrior, and she would not back down from this fight. Jackson stood beside her, a quiet but steady presence. They were ready for whatever came next. The mission was dangerous. The stronghold was heavily guarded, and there was no telling what kind of resistance they would face once they infiltrated it. But Lyra had faced worse. She had survived more than most could ever imagine, and she would see this through. The galaxy had already shown her its dark side. Now it was time to take control of her own fate. As the group made their way to the transport ship, Jackson looked over at Lyra. She was different now. She had changed since the day they had first met. She was no longer just the warrior who had been abandoned by her people. She was a leader, someone who had the power to shape her own future. He could see it in the way she carried herself, in the way she no longer hesitated to make decisions, to take charge. She had accepted the reality of their situation, and she had chosen to fight for what she believed in. "Are you sure about this?" Jackson asked, his voice soft. Lyra glanced at him, her eyes steady. "I'm sure. There's no turning back now." The transport ship lifted off, and as they flew toward the stronghold, Jackson could feel the weight of the galaxy's future on their shoulders. This was the beginning of a new chapter. The decisions they made now would determine the course of the war, the fate of the galaxy, and the future of the Alliance. But one thing was certain: Lyra and Jackson would face it together. As the ship descended toward the stronghold, Lyra's hand tightened around her weapon, her focus unwavering. The battle was about to begin, and they were ready to fight.